Make the choice to begin anywhere in your life, and the journey has started. And along the way, be inspired. Listen to the stories by joining the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick, on The Journey.
At such a critical time for race relations in our country, it is vital that we understand the role of journalism in steering our national conversation and social progress, or for that matter, a lack of it. Not only must our newsrooms reflect the communities where they are reporting, but we need to infuse the profession with diverse talent. Hello, my name is Dr. Wayne Frederick, and my guest today on The Journey is Nikole Jones, the Knight Chair in Race and Journalism at the Cathy Hughes School of Communication and founder of the Center for Journalism and Democracy. Ms. Jones, welcome to The Journey.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Frederick.
So I want to start at the very beginning. Why don't you tell us a bit about your childhood, where you grew up? I think you have some pretty amazing, diverse background in terms of your experience growing up, and that probably has informed your aperture to the world.
I didn't realize we were going to go that far back in history, but when I was a young lass, as you know, I grew up in the Midwest in a small town called Waterloo, Iowa, and even though people don't typically think about Black people and Iowa, I'm a child of the Great Migration, and Waterloo had a substantial Black population. And so I often think two things really drove my interest in news and history. One was both of my parents were avid readers, but my father in particular, I used to read the daily newspaper with him. That was a thing that we did together. Some of my earliest memories are reading the newspaper with my dad. And I got bused to white schools as part of a school desegregation program starting in the 2nd grade through 12th grade, and I just observed a lot of things on those long bus rides and being in white neighborhoods and white schools, mainly that their parents were not working harder than the parents in my community, that they didn't desire nice houses or safe neighborhoods any more than the people in my community, and yet they were able to acquire those things, and the hardworking people in my community were not. So I began to question why. And of course, the message we got from popular media, from society, didn't match what I was seeing and observing in my own neighborhood. And so I wanted to study history because history explained that. And I wanted to be a journalist because I understood even as a child how important it was for us to be able to shape the narratives of our own communities.
No, I think that's an important part, because one of the things that you did do was write a letter to the editor, if I remember you telling that story. So maybe you could tell our listeners that story about what motivated you to do that and what the response was.
Sure. So young Nikole was very nerdy. And as I said, I did read the newspaper with my dad, but I also paid attention to politics, and I was paying attention to race at a young age. So when I was 11, way back in 1988, Jesse Jackson was running for president. Of course, I was first in the nation primary, so he didn't do very well. I was watching the campaign. My mom particularly was very politically involved and politically active in her union, so he didn't do well. And so I decided to write a letter to the editor. And in that letter, I said that I felt Iowans didn't give Jesse Jackson a chance, in part because he was a Black man, but that I thought he was a good candidate. One day we'd have a Black president. And I remember every day going to the newspaper, opening to the opinion page and searching to see if they published my letter, and one day they did. And I never kind of, or I would say I always remember that sense of empowerment that I felt even as an 11-year-old, that you could see something in the world that you thought was unjust and you could write about it, and you may or may not change someone's mind, but you could at least force them to see from your perspective.
Yeah, no, every time I hear that story, it gives me chills, because I think, you know, at 11 to be that brave, that bold, and also I think to get that kind of result is empowering. I always talk about the fact that the best thing you could do is instill confidence in a kid, and I think that you know, is something that can really help in terms of someone's development, as it obviously did with you. Now, your father and his side of the family are Black, and your mother is white.
Yeah.
Tell us about your parents' background and how you self-identify today.
So yeah, my father was born in Greenwood, Mississippi, and my mother was born in rural Iowa. So you couldn't kind of imagine two more opposite childhoods and existences. And then they met at the college outside of my hometown. My father was just going there to chase women, as he said. My mom was actually a student there. I believe that growing up in that family, though having intimate relationships with both my white family and my black family, but really growing up in a black community around all of my black aunts and uncles. My grandparents disowned my mother when they first found out that she was dating a black man. That seeing that gave me, I think, a really sharp analysis of race, right? Because not only did I have the abstract notion of how race worked, I could see it in my own family. Both sides of my family were working class, but my grandfather on my mother's side had a factory job, and that union factory job was enough for him to take care of his family, have an acre of land, go on family vacations. My white grandmother never worked. And my black grandmother had a completely opposite experience, of course. And I've thought a lot about the fact that both of my father's mother and my mother's father were both born in the year 1926. But what was placed on their birth certificates, right, black woman and white male, would determine everything that they would have access to in society. So when my sisters and I were quite young, my father sat us down and told us that our mother was white, but we were black, and we were going to go through the world as black people and be treated as black people, and that's who we are. So I've always identified as a black woman. I just am a black woman with a white mother.
Okay, and that's interesting. As you said, your mother was politically active. You went to Waterloo West High School and wrote for the student newspaper.
I'm sure everyone watching this has heard of Waterloo West.
If they haven't, they've heard of it now. So tell me what Waterloo West was like when you went there. We won't discuss the dates, but just when you went there. What it
I've
was
already
like.
dated myself with the 1988, but yeah, so my hometown only had 2 public high schools, East and West, and all of my family, my black family, went to East High, but then we were part of a busing program. So as many of your viewers, at least of a certain age, will know that school desegregation really broke those legacy connections with your kind of neighborhood high school. So we were bused into the white high school. Our high school is about 20% black, and all of those kids were bused in. And that, of course, had such a, it was formative in shaping my views. We often weren't welcomed in the school. We weren't made to feel like we belonged in the school. I was one of a handful of black kids who were in the considered the academic track, but most of my black friends from the neighborhood were in the lower track. And I knew I wasn't, you know, smarter. Well, I was smarter than most of the kids in my high school, but not just the black kids. Right? So I just kind of always having to deal with those racial tensions in the school and really refusing to let white teachers exceptionalize me as they did with the handful of kids that were allowed into those academic classes. So I think that my political consciousness really was raised at that high school. That's where I had my first Black Studies class with Mr. Ray Dial, where I first got introduced really to Black literature and Black political theory and African history and Black American history. And it was that same teacher who encouraged me to join my high school newspaper when I complained to Mr. Dial that our high school paper never wrote about the black kids who were bused and our experiences and the stereotypes that we faced. And, you know, as great black educators will do, he said, join the paper and write those stories yourself, or shut up and don't complain anymore. So,
right, so
I'm an Aries, so of course I took the challenge.
Right. So I'm going to pull on that thread a little more. You've worked in North Carolina, Oregon, New York, and obviously you have a different view of the world, and there's a lot of focus on one body of work that you've done. But as I've said to you before, I think if people ever really step back and look at the full body of work that you've completed, they will see what I see, which I think is exceptionalism, but it's also based on excellence. So with that in mind, tell my viewers a bit about what has kind of shaped your view. You just mentioned desegregation and whether or not schools were really desegregated. I think you've done some work around that in terms of how people have tried to, kind of work around that.
Yes.
So I'd like to know kind of what that work has shown you, and why living in all these different places has given you this kind of, view of America and of some of those issues such as desegregation in schools or the lack of it?
Yeah, so as you know, most of my career was spent writing about school and housing segregation and not the 1619 Project, even though that's what I'm most well known for now. And I started covering education just because that was the first job I got as a journalist. I was placed on the education beat, but very quickly realized how important the education beat is, that so much of our inequality can be linked to education, but also so much of the promise of a society can be linked to education. And I started covering schools in Durham, North Carolina, and that would have been about 2003, and had learned that Durham Public Schools had just been released from a federal school desegregation order a decade earlier. And then I learned that there were all these districts that were still under school desegregation orders. And like many people, I thought this was a relic of the past. I didn't know that districts were still fighting, still fighting integration that late. And then when I started to look at the data, I saw that actually the most segregated parts of the country were not in the South. And of course, we're all kind of indoctrinated into this belief that the South is the racist part of the country and the North is the progressive and racially egalitarian part of society. Well, I already knew that wasn't true because I grew up in the Midwest and hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but I didn't realize that the most entrenched segregation was not actually in the South, not in housing and not in schools. And so that just led me to want to look more deeply into this issue of school segregation. Especially, I started reporting during No Child Left Behind, which was basically the George Bush policy saying we aren't going to try to break up poverty in schools. We're not going to try to break up racial concentration in schools. We're just going to test kids and give higher standards with no extra money and just somehow expect all schools to compete equally. And knowing what I knew, which is that black kids are not less capable or less intelligent than anyone else, I wanted to know why they weren't getting the same academic results. And so much of the data shows that, of course, what we know is black kids in black schools just don't get the same resources as other schools. They just never have. So that really is where I began to focus most of my work. And what I can tell you from living, as you said, I've lived in every region of the country, and wherever there are black people are segregated. Wherever there are black children are segregated. When I was in Portland, Portland's the whitest major city in the country, but they were all black schools in Portland, which would seem a numeric impossibility, except that it's not. And I think that really provided a critical perspective for me in my work, is trying to push back against this belief that somehow the segregation that you find where I live in New York City or Chicago or Philadelphia is more benign, like that, as if that is natural and not a result of policy and choice, but it is. And that is what you see when you travel the country or when you live in other places in the country.
And with respect to housing, I mean, like you said, you've mentioned it on education clearly. With respect to housing, what have you seen in terms of that earlier work as well, as it comes to whether it's housing in New York or in North Carolina, and how does that tie in so very closely to education?
Absolutely. So what we know is that the way that the North accomplished segregation was not necessarily by law, it was by housing. So you did have segregation laws in the North, but they were not nearly, of course, as pervasive or as entrenched in the South. What the North did is once black people started migrating, really beginning in the 1920s, is they began to architect segregation in housing, to create ghettos, to pen black people in, to have real estate covenants saying black people can't move in certain neighborhoods. And then, of course, the federal government gets involved in the 1930s when it introduces the practice of redlining in communities across the country. And so what my reporting finds is, again, the most segregated parts of the country in terms of housing are all in the Northeast and the Midwest. You could go down your list: New York, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Boston. Philadelphia, Boston. And that's because that was how the powerful people in those cities created segregation. And it's kind of a way of hiding your hand, right? Because if you segregate people in neighborhoods, you don't have to segregate the schools because most people went to neighborhood schools. You don't have to segregate restaurants or parks because people shop and eat where they live. And so it's worked quite well because now, after the passage of the civil rights legislation in the 60s ended discrimination by law, it did nothing to undo patterns of housing segregation. And so that has remained while, of course, Black people have access to public accommodations, Black people have access to the vote, but particularly in the North, they're still living in very segregated housing. Though I have to also add that we use housing as an excuse for school segregation, but our schools are actually more segregated than our housing is. And that's because white parents are choosing not to send their kids to neighborhood schools, even if their neighborhoods are integrated. And in fact, in a place like New York or a place like DC or Chicago, oftentimes white parents don't even want a neighborhood school, right? So they'll bus their kids or send their kids. They want choice if the district is integrated. If the district is segregated, then they want neighborhood schools. But either way, Black kids are the most segregated kids in America, and Black people are the most segregated people residentially in America.
So let's talk a bit about the 1619 project. What was the original genesis for it? Because, again, it takes on a lot of attention, but clearly it's something that you started and did a lot of research on, worked on for quite some time. So what was the original idea behind it?
In some ways, I feel like I've been working towards the 1619 Project my whole career. All of my journalism, as you know, was always about trying to excavate the past to help explain the current inequality that we see. I've always felt so much reporting on race is just very superficial. It's just a cataloging of maladies, right? A report about Black people suffering from this or suffering from that, as if no one's causing the suffering. And so I've always wanted to use my reporting to show the architecture of the inequality. What were the policies? What were the laws? Who are the decision makers that have led to this inequality? And I would kind of joke with my editors that my articles kept getting longer and longer because I was moving further and further back in time, and that eventually I was going to get back to 1619. It was a joke, but not really, obviously. So when the 400th anniversary of 1619 was approaching in 2019, early 2019, I just decided I wanted to force an acknowledgement of that date, of the weight of that date, of how foundational slavery was. That there's almost nothing in America that's 400 years old, but slavery is. And that it couldn't just be me writing a single essay or article, that it required something really big. And so I thought, let's just take over the whole issue of the New York Times Magazine and dedicate it to excavating the modern legacy of slavery. So that was really the genesis of the project. And I always think it's important for people who haven't actually read the project, for people who have only heard about the project, to know that this is a work of multiple writers. Some of the most renowned historians in our country are authors in the project, and some of the most renowned journalists are authors in the project, and then many, many, many more who consulted, who fact-checked on the project. It really is it is a collective project. It is a project that seeks to represent the 40 million descendants of American slavery.
So, this, I'd say this past summer, I had the opportunity to go to Senegal and Ghana in particular, go to Elmira Castle, and I'm sure for everybody who goes there, it was just as emotional. What struck me is my tour guide, who has done this for many, many years, at one point was, basically was crying while describing, in one of the dungeons, describing the peasants. And that really touched me, because I was thinking, this is somebody that could be doing this every single day, and it could become rote, to your point, and that blunting of the human emotion around something so deep can be troubling. So as you did the project, knowing all that you've known, if you can isolate one part of it that probably was shocking to you, that somebody else may have either written or researched, that when you read it, you saw, it was still shocking to you with all the knowledge that you've had about the things that you were excavating. As you said, it wasn't just a catalog of maladies, but what malady in particular probably stood out for you?
So there's so much that is deeply troubling in the project. And it was the most emotionally taxing project that I've ever worked on. But if I were, I'm going to give two things that surprised me. One one painful, one kind of joyful, but is Dorothy Roberts' essay on race, which I assigned to Dorothy Roberts because, I mean, you know, she's just the expert and on Black women and the way Black women's bodies have been used and the way that society has seen Black women. And I wanted her to write an essay about kind of how Black women's wombs were used to recreate slavery, right? Slavery is literally created through Black women's wombs, and even to this day, we find Black women's reproduction as problematic. And the essay that she produced, even though I knew, I mean, I signed it, so I knew some of the generalities, just thinking about the fact that Black women were not considered rapeable by law. You could not sexually assault a Black woman, no more than you could sexually assault cattle. That the only crime that was committed if a Black woman was raped was the crime against her owner for you possibly damaging property, and that rape was, of course, incentivized because you just want Black women to reproduce. And it was the first time that I read about breeding, that we think a lot about the physical labor of slavery, being in the fields or, you know, working wherever Black people were working in physical labor, but not the sexual labor that Black women were being forced into. And just to have to sit and think, you know, about that, and then particularly sit in that as a Black woman was, I mean, even now, it's something I can't quite wrap my mind around.
And that touched me in Elmira Castle, too, the description of that in particular, how women were selected, you know, for the governor. And so you're absolutely right, that's a very, very painful experience to relive and to even retell, as
Absolutely.
you're describing.
And, you know, it's encoded. It's literally encoded in the DNA of Black people in the Atlantic world. When you DNA test Black Americans, we come back about a quarter of our ancestry goes to Europe, and almost all through the male line, right? So it's literally like that forced rape is in our bodies, and I imagine we carry some of that trauma with us, and this is one of those reasons why so many Black people claim they have Indian in their family, is because it feels less shameful than acknowledging why we really have the hair or complexion that we have. But something else that really surprised me was that I ended up writing a patriotic essay, which I never consider myself a patriotic person. I didn't intend to write a patriotic essay, but spending so much time when I was researching for the democracy essay, reading Black people claiming ownership over the country that they built, even though they weren't citizens, even though they weren't free, even though they had no reason to believe this country would ever treat them right, but refusing to be colonized elsewhere, and saying, you know, this is our country. Our ancestors' bones are buried in this soil. Our blood has been spilled on this soil. And while I'm not going to fly an American flag, I certainly believe we have a right to do so, and a right to claim the lineage of the country we built. So that was surprising to me as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Now, you turned this into a children's book.
Yes.
Why? Why you thought it was important to have a children's book version?
Sure. So the children's book is called Born on the Water, and I call it an origin story for Black American descendants of slavery. And there were two reasons why we decided to do the children's book. One, just so many people were asking for it. When the first original project came out in 2019, I just had so many parents and educators, particularly Black parents, who said, we need something for our children. We don't want to wait until they're old enough to read the 1619 Project to be able to talk about these things and introduce these things and give them a sense of pride in what our people have built here. And then the other part was like for little Nikole, you know, thinking about, I wish someone had taught me not to feel ashamed of slavery when I was a child, and seeing that even with my own daughter, so in the Midwest, all Black people are from the South. But in New York, Black people come from a lot of different countries. And when my daughter got that flag assignment that so many kids get, draw the flag of, your ancestral land and write a report on it. All the black kids most of the black kids in her class had a flag to draw. They were drawing the flag of Trinidad or Jamaica or, of the Dominican Republic. And here my child is in the same position that I was all those years ago. Like, what flag am I supposed to draw? So I wanted to create this book to give us, the black people in this country who descend from American slavery, black children, a sense of pride that slavery for us was about resistance, resilience, that we had a history before we were brought over the Atlantic, and that we have a right to claim our country that we built just like everyone else claims their countries.
So you've used the phrase, come home to train your own. What does that mean and why Howard?
Well, let me just first say, Howard has been amazing. I teach on Mondays, and it's like my favorite day of the week. It's everything that I expected it would be, which is the students are just so engaged and dynamic, and they like tough love, and I like to give it. So it's just been great. The older I've gotten, when I was younger, I really bought into this notion that so many of us, when you grow up in a working class black community, have kind of instilled in us that if someone in your community sees potential in you, they always tell you, get your education and get out of here. And so many of us are raised to think that success means going into white institutions, proving you can compete in white institutions, and then suffering the whole time, right? Because these institutions aren't built for us. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that was the wrong message, and that's not the life that I want to live. And so it just was a natural choice. I don't know if you remember this, but a few years before, right before COVID, Jelani Cobb and Ta-Nehisi and I gave a talk here. And one of the students asked me, why don't you come teach at Howard? And I was like, nobody ever asked me to come teach at Howard, or I'd come teach at Howard. So it's always been something that I wanted. I always knew eventually if I went into academia, I would come to an HBCU because this is where my heart is. I want to spend the time working with students who were like me and building institutions for students who were like me. And, where else would you want to go besides Howard?
Great. Well, I'm glad I got a chance to ask you to come and teach at Howard, and that you said yes. Thank you for being here. My guest today was Nikole Hannah-Jones, the Knight Chair in Race and Journalism at the Cathy Hughes School of Communications and founder of the Center for Journalism and Democracy. I'm Dr. Wayne Frederick. Please join me next time on The Journey.
This program was produced by WHUT and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. For more information on this program or any other program, please visit our website at whut.org. Thank you.